This is section 8.4. We're going to start out with simplifying rational expressions. Okay, that's our objective here. We're going to worry about multiplication and division later, but for today we're just going to simplify rational expressions. Okay, I've given you some steps here on how to simplify a rational expression. First thing we're going to do, we're going to factor all and any of the expressions that we have, both numerator and denominator. Okay, now when we talk about rational expressions, a rational expression is essentially a ratio or a fraction, okay, with variables in it. All right, so first step here is we're going to factor all and any of the expressions. Now, once we get done factoring everything, second thing we're going to do is we're going to state what we call the domain of the expression. So which x values make the denominator to become 0. Now, there's a couple of ways that we're going to do this, okay? You're going to set each part of the denominator equal to 0 and solve. That's how you find the domain. Okay, so you're going to take each part of the denominator and you're going to set it equal to 0 and then solve it. That will give you what the domain is of the expression. Now the domain, why do we have to state the domain? Well, as we look at the domain, okay, the domain essentially tells us what numbers can the variable not be. And the reason we have that is because we have a fraction. So what number cannot be in the bottom of a fraction? Well, that's the number 0. Okay, so we got to figure out what numbers that we're going to put in for x that's going to make that denominator 0. And we got to tell it that, okay, if x is 3, that makes 0 in the denominator, we can't have x be 3. Okay, so we cannot have a 0 in the denominator. That's why we state the domain. Okay, and you'll see how I do that here in the examples. And then finally, the third step here is we're going to simplify the expression by canceling anything that's the same in the numerator and denominator, just like you would in any regular fraction. Okay. All right, so let's take a look here at the first example. Okay, we talked about factoring here. So the very first thing we're going to do is factor the top and the bottom. So I need to find factors of 10 that add to 7, and that is 5 and 2. So on the top, I've got x squared plus 5x plus 2x plus 10. If I factor that out, I'm going to end up with an x out here and an x plus 5 left over. Take out a 2 here, x plus 5 left over, and that's going to factor out to an x plus 5 and an x plus 2. So, on the top, I have an x plus 5 and an x plus 2. Okay. In the denominator, I'm going to do the same thing. On the bottom, I'm finding factors of negative 10 that add to negative 3, and that's negative 5 and positive 2. So again, I've got to break that down, x squared minus 5x plus 2x minus 10, parentheses around the first 2 and last 2. Again, this is why we talked about factoring earlier as a review. Take out an x, left with an x minus 5. Take out a 2. Left with an x minus 5. And I have an x minus 5 with an x plus 2 left over. And this is going to be on the denominator. X minus 5 and an x plus 2. Okay, so I've factored everything. That's the first step. Second step says I got to state my domain. So the domain, I'm going to set each part of the denominator equal to 0 and solve it. So for the domain, I take x minus 5, and that cannot be 0, and x plus 2 cannot be 0. So if I solve for x, this means x cannot be 5. That's one of my domains. And if I subtract 2 here, x cannot be negative 2. That's the second domain. Okay? So this, again, this tells me if I put 5 in for x right here, that's going to make 0. 0 times anything is 0, which gives me 0 in the denominator. I cannot have 0 in the denominator. Okay, so these are my domain. These are the numbers that x cannot be. Okay, once I figured out my domain, now I can take a look at my expression and see what's the same on the top and on the bottom. Okay, well, I've got an x plus 2 and an x plus 2 on the top and bottom. I can cross one of those out, each for each other. Okay, now, as you look at the x plus 5 and the x minus 5, are these the same? No, they're not. I can't cross them out. So my final simplified answer is just x plus 5 over x minus 5. Okay? So again, you factor it, you find the domain, simplify your answer. Okay, let's take a look at example number 2. First thing I got to do is factor the top. Factors of -8 that add to 2 are positive 4 and negative 2. So I've got an x squared. So we go top here. X squared plus 4x minus 2x minus 8. So here I'm going to take out an x. I'm left with an x plus 4. Here I'm going to take out a negative 2. Left with an x plus 4. I have an x plus 4 in common with an x minus 2 left over. So this is going to be on the top, x plus 4, x minus 2. On the bottom, factors of 6 that add to negative 5 are negative 3 and negative 2. So I've got x squared minus 3x minus 2x plus 6. Again, looking at factoring here, take out an x, left with an x minus 3. Take out a negative 2, left with an x minus 3. X minus 3 in common. X minus 2 left over. So I have now factored the expression. Next thing I got to do is figure out my domain. On my domain, take the 2 parts in the bottom. So in this case, x cannot be 3 if I add 3 to each side to solve it. And in this case, x cannot be 2. Okay, so I found my domain. Now I go back here to the top, and I cancel out things that are exactly the same. And I end up with an x plus 4 over an x minus 3. And this guy right here is my answer. Okay, now, one last thing here before we finish up for this part of the section. I want to go back up top and look at number 1. Now, a couple things here on number 1 that I want to discuss. You cannot cancel out parts. And what I mean by that is as I look at this, this on the top is all one item. Okay, they're all one thing, they're hooked together by these plus signs. Okay, so this, it's like they're linked together. These are all 3 linked together. So for example, I cannot do this. I cannot cancel out my 10 and my negative 10. I can't do that. I can't cancel out parts and leave what's left over. Okay, the minus and the plus signs bind these together as whole things. Okay, so the whole thing on the top is a trinomial. These 3 things are all together, and these 3 things are all together. You cannot cancel out parts. That's very important because a lot of the things that you're going to see is some of you are going to want to do is you're going to want to cancel out those 10s right away. Or you're going to want to cancel out the x squares. You cannot do that. Okay? All right, this concludes part 1 of section 8.4. Make sure that you complete the WSQ that I have sent to your email. Okay, answer those questions and be ready so you're prepared for class tomorrow.